The right to land and housing is an illusion. Comrade Kostia, in these years of struggle, I've seen peasants disappear overnight, with no one knowing their whereabouts, while their wives and children are left to fend for themselves. We are treated like animals in the pasture. Encouraged by Sumarokov's support, Kostia gave him an intelligent look. At least someone was daring enough to point out his difficulties. The others, so poor and subjugated, didn't even dare think, believing that everything that happened to them was pure fate. They lived seemingly content, but deep down they harbored hatred and a desire for revenge, despite their ignorance and submission to the most absurd evils. They feared for themselves and their children. They were afraid of making things worse. Those meetings at Kostia promoted awakened in them the desire to fight to change such a cruel fate. Feelings of revolt and adherence to communist ideas began to emerge in one or another mujik. When, in the fields, the mujiks knew that Kostia would come to speak to them, their work became lighter because, finally, someone interested in them appeared, and everyone felt more encouraged. Kostia was seen as a leader, and his word, salvation, soul of my soul, 116. Those secret meetings encouraged the poor mujiks and gave them a sense of importance they had never known. The most fearful were quickly convinced by the boldest and 17 designation given to the Russian aristocrats who followed the reigning princes in the nobility hierarchy. Note, everyone cherished a desire to escape from captivity. Kostia gave them back their joy and hope for a better life. Even the mujiks who managed to obtain a plot of land, no matter how small, never escaped their master's barbaric regime, because all their labor remained dependent on his malicious force. After a few years, or even less, the mujik was forced to return his gains to his master, as he had no time to care for his property. There was no point in having young children help with the work and improve their lives, because when they grew up, they were subjected to forced labor, eating only what was strictly necessary. They never achieved independence. Kostia had surveyed small landowners and analyzed their small-scale production, studying ways to establish a cooperative that, in other places he visited, was yielding good results, with many of them gaining autonomy. The courageous young man faced the people's ignorance and dedicated his life to his ideal. Kostia connected well with the intellectuals, some of them sons of aristocrats who, moved by the new ideas emerging in the capital, disagreed with the autocratic regime and yearned for change. These were the idealists, sons of the aristocratic bourgeoisie, who had become impoverished and were also on the verge of serfdom. Others did so out of pure humanitarian sentiment, disagreed with their parents' attitude, and leaning toward the working class, always incognito. 22 Alex Norabad, an idealist life on the Norabad estate, had changed significantly with the presence of Professor Semlin, who was in that remote area at the invitation of Alex, Norabad's son. They met at the university and became friends. Semlin appeared to be a prim young man, but in reality, he came from a class of ruined mudjuks. He managed to study due to his artistic and intellectual gifts. He excelled so well that he won the sympathy of the professors, who soon invited him to teach. Wanting to return to his roots, Semlin, fed up with the city, accepted Alex's invitation to come work for his family. Both, however, had agreed that it would be best to keep their friendship secret. Semlin had similar ideas to Kostia, and to hide their true intentions, they decided that Semlin would come first, then Alex. Alex posed as an irresponsible bohemian to better defend his revolutionary ideals. When Norabad's son disappeared from the scene, his father and family judged him on cruises around Spain. His travels, however, were completely different. Alex was known to all the mujiks as Yago, and no one suspected he was a son of the aristocracy, and worse, of the feared Norabad. Alex, Semyon, and Kostia wanted to implement their revolutionary ideas and free the poor mujiks from their condition of serfdom, and to do so, they devised a cunning plan, in absolute secrecy, defending themselves from the wrath of the landowners. After a few months, when the teacher was already giving classes, on the occasion of the appearance of the ghost that threatened the health of the mujik Sumarokov's daughter, Alex appeared again on the farm scene, with his carefree manner of a bon vivant, a bohemian of the aristocracy, who thought of nothing else but enjoying life and spending his rich father's money. The elegant boy was chatting animatedly with his mother when she introduced him to Semyon, Sasha's new teacher. Both pretending to see each other for the first time, greeted each other discreetly. Finally, we have someone to break the monotony of this palace, he praised his father's happy idea. Filling a glass with drink, Sonia, unfazed by her husband's arrival, tried to get Simeon's attention, but she tried to stay closer to Alex, who was chatting animatedly in a corner with the professor. In Sonia's presence, they changed the subject and began discussing the ghost's latest appearance, a fact that greatly interested Simeon, who wanted to hear Alex's opinion. That conversation depressed Alex, for he knew it was a product of his father's wickedness. He emptied the glass in one go and refilled it, unaware that he was following in his father's footsteps. The drink was already altering his behavior, and soon, completely drunk, he cursed Sasha, his beloved little sister. The curse fell upon him as well. The party celebrating Alex's arrival ended as usual, father, son, and drunken guests. Mrs. Norabod was even more desolate, thinking of her beloved daughter, who would never return to her arms. She felt very alone with the attitude of her husband and son, who didn't even bother to correct Sonia's recklessness. Such behavior left her more depressed than ever. Therefore, she often went to the Izba in the enclosure to talk to Katienka and see Mayra. There, at least, she breathed a softer, more balanced air. That girl, with each passing day, looked more like her Sasha. How they were alike. The poor woman tried to surround her with every comfort possible, bringing her food, warm clothes, some furniture, toys, and hair ornaments. Her attitude eventually caught Norabod's attention. 23 Norabod and the Ghost. One day, the feared Norabod decided to see for himself if the rumors about his wife were true and went down to the enclosure not far from his home. He had dawned that day less shaky and more energetic. Helped by a servant, he walked slowly to the enclosure's Izba, which had been closed since his daughter's death, because it was there, in the very hut, according to Sergei, that she and the mujik were hiding. He never passed by there again, and he didn't even like to look at the hut. Sumarokov and his family had been living there for many months. First, he went to see for himself if Sergei's rumors were true, and second, he wanted to meet Yulian, Sumarokov's daughter, who had also seen her daughter's ghost. The old man had slipped out, leaning on a heavy cane and his servant. It was early. Sumarokov was at work, and his older children were with Professor Semyon. He stood in front of the Izba, observing the improvements his servant had made. He had to admit, Sumarokov was a very smart, hard-working, and polite peasant. Interested in the improvements that had completely transformed the place, he observed the yard, the poultry Sumarokov raised, and some reindeer and sheep kept in a kind of shelter he had built just for them. The place exuded simplicity, cleanliness, and comfort. While Norabod inspected the Izba from the outside and its surroundings, Katienka heard the noise and peered through a crack in the door at the feared lord of the land. Startled, she carefully unlocked the door and remained silent. The old man resumed his walk, head down. He was very broken. The old man, curious, began observing the Sumarokov family, but without the courage to approach the girl, who reminded him of his ill-fated Sasha Alexnovich. It seemed something was preventing him from speaking to her, but the same wasn't true of his wife. The woman had been clearly showing her joy when she returned from the Izba, and he suspected that such happiness stemmed from living with the Sumarokovitsky family. He was intrigued to learn that his wife would lavish such attention on a family of mujiks. They were proud and didn't mingle with the servants, considering them barbaric, barons, illiterate and lazy, and who should be treated like dogs. Maria, I know you often go to the Sumarokovitsk house. Can you tell me what attracts you so much? Haven't you seen how hard-working and educated these peasants are? Yes, I know. But we had others too like that, and yet you didn't approach us like that. Her husband was right, and Maria Norabod couldn't tell him the real reason, why she felt so good going to the Izba in the enclosure. After some thought, she ventured to tell her husband what she had really found in that poor family. Norabod, have you seen Sumarokov's daughter? She's a very image of our Sasha when she was your age. Norabod was shocked and his eyes widened. What do you say, woman? Our daughter is dead, buried. But no one really knows what happened that night, said Mrs. Norabod, testing her husband, because they avoided talking about such a subject, so as not to arouse suspicion and the memory of the sad episode that they would like to forget and that had marked their lives so much. Norabad frowned and grumbled angrily. You mean the bastard? Yes, Norabad, I mean our granddaughter. You never told me what you did with her. Maria Norabad was exalted and became courageous in the face of her husband's fragility, to the point of approaching him directly, staring into his red eyes. She could be our granddaughter. Why are you now worried about such a fate, if not even I know? She died. Where then is her body? She disappeared. Maria Alexandrovna Norabad was tired of knowing that her husband was to blame for that tragedy, and that he was the sole cause of it all. Out of pure pity, she didn't approach him, seeing that he wasn't fully accountable for his actions. Norabad, the feared master, was nothing more than a decrepit, trembling, drunken old man. That child who had appeared on the farm scene, whose resemblance to her daughter was undeniable, gave her the courage to confront him, and the matter, covered in ashes, took on great proportions between them. She, out of a need to know exactly what happened to Sasha's daughter, and he, out of having to account for a gesture that weighed on his conscience, realized. Guilty essence that he was trying to drown in drink. Norabad, I need to know what happened. Who authorized our granddaughter's disappearance? Was it Sergei, or am I mistaken? The husband was turning pale and couldn't speak. Something strange was happening to him. Nervously, the woman spoke loudly. Are you deaf? I'm talking to you. Norabad remained silent. His brain seemed blocked, his hands trembled, and nervous fever soon overtook him, causing a terrible epileptic fit. The old man fell. He tried to lift him, but couldn't. Seeing him writhing on the ground, he became afraid and ran for help because, when he fell, his forehead had hit the floor and was covered in blood. His body had stiffened, his hands clenched, and he writhed on the floor, drooling. It was a horrible scene. This seemed like the end. A few minutes later, everyone rushed to help their father. Alex, helped by a servant, carried him to bed. The old man was paralyzed, demonstrating that, in addition to the epileptic seizure, he had also suffered a cerebral embolism. The situation was serious, and Alex rushed to the doctor. The doctor could do little. The case was irreversible, characteristic of a stroke with serious aftereffects. Norabad remained silent for weeks. They knew he was still alive because he breathed and moaned. His condition was deplorable. He never uttered a word again. Only his eyes moved, but he recognized no one else. Sasha's ghost was there with him, and its presence increased his despair. He wanted to speak, he tried, but his effort exhausted him. Tears streamed from his dull, red eyes. Several weeks passed since the fatal fall, during which the family took turns caring for the sick man. Norabad couldn't bear the shock of learning that his granddaughter might be alive, as he had believed her dead, as had been his order. Those events he had tried so hard to forget came flooding back. The shock paralyzed him completely, and his conscience pounded so hard that he could bear no longer, and ended up disembodying in the greatest despair and suffering. During this time, the spirit of Sasha would not abandon him, causing him intense bitterness. He wanted to ask for mercy for his spirit, but could not. No one could help him. Norabad didn't even have the relief of begging forgiveness for his mistakes. He would now appear in the spiritual realm to account to God for the insane acts perpetrated against poor peasants and his daughter Sasha. He also took to his grave the secret of the disappearance of his granddaughter, whom he had ordered killed. No one mourned Norabad's death, not even his descendants. Only Maria Norabad, his widow, shed discreet tears, mourning her misfortune rather than her own loss. She was freeing herself from a malicious being, insensitive to human suffering, who had caused all her misfortune. Charity dictated that many masses be said for his intentions, and she paid for several celebrations at the church, as was tradition. The more candles and masses said, the more salvation the deceased found. Norabad money served only to enrich the priest. However, all of this was nothing more than an illusion for the family and irony for the peasants who saw it as just another act of disrespect towards God. Sergei, more feared than his master, attended the funeral with his family, because no one was more complicit with Norabad's actions than he. Alex would assume the fate of his father's lands, as the only male in the family and legitimate heir. The peasants were now completely under Sergei's command. Many, ignorantly, believed he was the owner of the lands. For a long time, Sergei, taking advantage of Norobod's imbalance in his son's absence, had been posing as the master, earning both fear and respect. When the serfs learned that Alex was the master's son and the one in charge of the estate, they calmed down, sensing better fortunes. Everyone hoped for Sergei's dismissal. 24 Sergei and the servants. Sergei, however, had hatched a cunning plot and worked so hard for his own benefit that he owned property almost as large as that of the Norobodskis. He had enticed some vengeful peasants, whom he kept under his complete control, and they, in turn, dominated the poor, ignorant peasants. During his final years, Norobod's madness favored his plans. Little by little, he fenced off his property, annexing other areas stolen from the peasants, which they had acquired through 10 years of labor, destroying them and their families. In this way, his estate expanded, using the labor of Norobod's employees for the plantations. There was no law regulating this situation, favoring Sergei, who legally owned the assets signed over to Norobod. The serfs never knew who their real master was, because the foreman handled everything with such ease and confidence that he aroused no suspicion. Many saw him as Norobod himself. Knowing he was dead, they began to feel that they, too, had been deceived. Serfdom had ended, but some landlords continued to use the same method, and many ignorant peasants persisted in receiving food and housing instead of wages. The Norobod farm was typical. Serfdom had been abolished, and they remained subject to the old regime, ignoring the law that had freed them. This was precisely the revolution that Alex, Semyon, and Kostia proposed to mujiks who remained, out of fear or ignorance, in a state of servitude. Alex Alexnovich Norobod was now sitting at his father's large desk, examining some documents, when Sergei entered. He had never liked the overseer, but he respected his father's decision. He had to first learn the real state of affairs before deporting him. "Sit down," Sergei invited the young man. Alex had long wanted to have a conversation with the overseer, but his life away from the farm and the friendship his father seemed to have for him prevented him from approaching the disgusting employee. Sergei was so shrewd that not even Alex, with all his intelligence, could overpower him. The man had come armed with arguments to defend himself against possible reprisals from Norobod's son. Alex tried to push away the repulsion he felt for the employee, controlling himself because he needed him, or rather, he had to keep him close until the appropriate moment, to expel him from his lands, feigning interest in keeping him on the farm. "Sergei, from now on, you will be required to report to me on all acts related to property. Soon, we will verify the boundaries of the Norobod lands and the employees who live with their families under servitude." As if he had expected this, Sergei made himself available. It was time to account for the irregularities he had concocted, but he feared nothing, as he had all the documents legally signed by Norobod. There was no law that could take away his property, and, if necessary, he would use his method against that little tie who now dared to interfere in his command. "Okay, Mr. Alex, whatever you say. Prepare the horses. Don't you prefer the troika, sir?" he asked ironically, as he had never seen Alex ride an animal. "Horses," the young man replied dryly. Sergei stepped out, stomping harder than usual across the wooden floor, and as he left, he passed Sonia as she entered. He gave her a covetous look, because he was one of the men she was with. Sonia's attitude toward men did much to undermine Alex, who was considered a weak man, lacking control even with his wife, who, in her husband's absence, or even when he was at the farm, missed no opportunity to disrespect him. Her attitude, though visible to everyone, left Alex indifferent. He didn't love his wife, and any day now, he would put an end to the unpleasant situation that tarnished his honor. The young man would rather suffer worse, drunk and irresponsible, than assume the role of a betrayed husband, a strategy he used to disguise the movement for the liberation of the mujiks, of which he was a leader. Sonia wasn't used to her husband's presence on the farm, and found it strange that he'd gotten up in the early hours of the morning to examine the papers. Despite her bad habits of frivolity, she wasn't ignorant. She was well educated, but she didn't know how to use her gifts, and, disgusted by Alex's disregard for her, she retaliated with irreverent behavior. Deep down, she suffered from his disinterest. The two had barely spoken, but now they sat face to face, eye to eye. Everyone in the house was still shocked by Norobod's swift and unexpected demise, and even after the funeral, there was a certain question in the air a question Alex responded to with great interest, with a new attitude that surprised everyone. The young man, previously carefree and detached from his father's business, now took charge of everything, rising early and dedicating himself to visiting all areas of the empire left by the wealthy Norabad. Sonia, despite not respecting her status as his wife, was respectful of her as she had always been treated politely, albeit coldly, by her husband. Alex would not allow her to get close to him, so that now they seemed like strangers, face to face in icy silence. He was the one who broke the ice. Sonia, from now on, I want you to assume your role as wife. Help my mother with the management of the house and dedicate yourself more to Sasha's education, following the studies that Professor Simeon teaches her. Her husband's tone was so stern that she was startled, as if she had never seen such a man before. In fact, it was the first time he had spoken like that, with such authority. Alex's eyes had a new sparkle, and she had never realized how beautiful they were. That conversation left her completely speechless. His soft, authoritative tone didn't allow her to argue. But to carry out his orders, she shifted in her chair, unable to understand what was happening. Tried to mumble something, but her voice caught in her throat. Alex, sensing her embarrassment, sympathized, changing the authoritative tone of his voice. Do you need anything? No. I hope what I told you is clear. Of course. Having nothing to ask, leave me alone, as I have numerous documents to examine. Sonia left, embarrassed by her husband's new attitude and a little ashamed of herself. His sudden authority left her speechless. He treated her as if she were inferior. She couldn't decide which would be the best treatment. First with disregard, or now with complete contempt. And the flirtatious woman spent the day pensive and awkward, as if she had been disarmed. Her attitude didn't go unnoticed by her mother-in-law. What had the couple discussed, after all, to make Sonia lose her spontaneity and joy? 25, not everything that appears is true. A new chapter was beginning for the Grand Norobodvisky estate. The employees' anticipation was high, and everyone hoped Sergei would be relieved of his post. The two men now roamed the estate on horseback. Alex rode as well as Sergei. To Sergei's amazement, one day was enough to cover all the land in the rye, wheat, sunflower, and sugar beet fields. As their master passed, the moujiks bowed deeply and only rose after he had passed. Upon seeing their new master, they said, "Sweat,